taking place, whether or not the hottest ticket for this kind of extended period this weekend was the Rolling Stones at Glastonbury or Ken Robinson at the RSA. And I think it was Ken, really. That's the more elite contested ticket. So I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event. I'm Matthew Turr, Chief Executive of the RSA. Could you do whatever you have to do to your mobile phone, including me, so it doesn't make a noise, but feel free to keep it on and to tweet. Today's hashtag is RSA Robinson. Also, we are streaming live, so hello to all our web viewers. I know there's a lot of web viewers because we had about 10 times as many people wanting to come to the event than could get in. So welcome to you. You'll be able to watch this event again on our website in a few days' time and share it with other people. A couple of other little announcements before I introduce Ken. We're delighted that today's event also launches a new collaboration with Samsung Mobile, and it's due to their generous support that we're able to hold this event. Also, Ken, I think since the first time you came to the RSA, I'm able to say that the RSA's education work has expanded a great deal over that time, partly inspired by your ideas. So we have a growing program of policy research and practical innovations based on our core principles here at the RSA of tackling disadvantage, building democratic participation and fostering open-minded inquiry. So I think on your seats you've got a copy of our education update, and in July some of the things we're doing is we're launching our new program called Grand Curriculum Designs, which is around enabling teachers to develop the skills to develop their own curricula, a report on in-year admissions, and also a podcast created by students from our 5 academies on the issue of dealing with uncertainty. And indeed, some students are here today from Whitley. There they are. Hi. And at the end of the event, they're going to be going around with mics, grabbing some of you for Vox Pops. So I know you've got to rush off, but if you can give them a few seconds to tell them what you think of the event or whatever, that would be absolutely great. Now, all that's out of the way, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Sir Ken Robinson. He really doesn't need any introduction, and I will be very brief. Sir Ken is one of the world's leading authorities on creativity, innovation and education. He's worked with governments, organisations and companies around the globe. The RSA Animate of his changing education paradigms has been watched over 10 million times, and my colleagues and I receive daily emails from teachers and students around the world whose everyday lives have been changed as a result of engaging with Ken's groundbreaking ideas. He joins us today to deliver the long-awaited follow-up to that celebrated talk, and we are, needless to say, absolutely delighted to have you back again. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sir Ken Robinson.
Well, thank you, Matthew. I was very impressed when I was told this room sold out. I had no idea it was so small. And free. So it's much less impressive, isn't it, really? If this was £50 a ticket at the O2 Arena, I'd be feeling better. But thank you, Matthew. It's a pleasure to be here. I say that because you have to, don't you? What am I going to say? I really wish this wasn't happening. But I am very pleased to be back, and not least because we're now back in England. My wife and I, Terry is here, we live in Los Angeles, in California these days. We've been there for 12 years. And it's a pleasure to be back to discover that everything is fine with education here. That all our work has paid off, and we're now in calm waters, fully confident in the leadership that's steering us ahead into the future. So congratulations, everybody. It's been a big group effort, and it's all been worth it, I feel. When I was last here, I was asked to talk about changing education paradigms, and I gave a talk for about an hour and a quarter. You can relax, don't worry, this is short. About an hour and a quarter, and a few months later, Matthew sent me an email saying we have condensed this talk into 11 minutes. and animated it. And here it is. And it wasn't, is this okay? It was, here it is. And it's online now, and it's going to be seen by millions of people, so we hope you're happy. And I am happy with it. But of course, it was truncated, necessarily. I've got a lot of kudos from this talk, actually, over the past few years, because many people think it's my hand doing it. You know, they think, how does he talk and draw that quickly? So I was impressed. But the people from Cognitive Media are here today, aren't you? Somewhere in their presence, yeah. I want to offer congratulations. I think it's a fantastic visualization of what I was talking about. And I'd really just wanted to pick up, really, from there, since there was only 11 minutes of it remaining. But really what I was arguing about was that education is in the grip of a series of ideologies which are counterproductive, I would say. On the one hand, we're in the intellectual grip still of a very narrow view of intelligence. We tend in education to confuse and conflate intelligence with a particular form of academic ability. And academic ability is extremely important, but there's much more to human intelligence than it. It's a very particular set of capacities for deductive reasoning, for propositional knowledge, and it's important, but if that's all there were to human intelligence, most of human life would never have taken place. There would be no culture as we know it. And there are historical reasons why our conception of intelligence has become so narrow. But I see it reflected still in the government policies of the day. I'm not here to make any ad hominem comments about this particular government. But this particular government still labours under the misapprehension that the highest form of human aspiration is to go to Oxford or Cambridge. Now, I'm not criticising Oxford and Cambridge. They are lovely towns and have wonderful pubs. But the idea that the whole purpose of education and its success is to be judged by entrance to these two universities is preposterous. And moreover, the whole system can be measured against how many people from working class backgrounds get to these universities. It's a laudable aspiration for those people who may be interested. But I've been to Oxford and Cambridge, and I know they are smaller than the whole country. So we can't all go, can we? There have to be, even if there are no other arguments, there are logistical arguments why we cannot expand them beyond the perimeters of the M11. But it all reflects this obsession with a particular type of academic ability. And it's in the name of this that so many people have gone through the whole of their education feeling they're not very smart. And I think it's a disastrous waste of human talent. I always have done. The second feature of our education systems that I talked about last time is that they are modelled on the organisational principles of industrialism. It's essentially a factory model. Most of what goes on in our education systems does not happen outside of them. You know, this business, for example, of having bells ringing and people being shuffling around the building. If you were running a business on that basis, you wouldn't last. You know, if you had a business with 1,000 employees, and every 40 minutes a bell rang, and everyone had to go to a different room in a different part of the building and do something else with a separate group of people, and you rinse and repeat 8 times a day, you'd be broke in a week. And yet we think it's a good way to run education. It is not. Most of the organisational principles that we still adhere to in education have nothing to do with education. They're simply logistical devices to promote efficiency of people shuffling through. So when I talk about the need for there to be a revolution, I'm not a lone voice in this, and people have been calling for it for a very long time. And what I want to do just here today, because we have some time for conversation too, is to move on from saying what's wrong to how we might fix it, and what the emergent system might look like. And really what I want you to believe is that the industrial model which likens human systems to machines is wrong now at every point. It doesn't answer to the way human lives are actually lived, and it doesn't answer to the way we should be running our institutions. Governments still believe that's the case. You see it in their language, you hear it in their policies and in the rhetoric. I'm not just talking about here in the UK. I've been around long enough now to have seen many Secretaries of State come and go. And I look forward with enthusiasm to my next experience of this very process. But it's also true in the United States. That's to say, many policymakers, not all of them, and I'm not attacking policymakers, by the way, I want to encourage them to think differently too, since we need them. That many policymakers seem to think that you can improve the system simply by issuing commands to it, by tightening standards, by issuing directives. It's a machine-age attitude. It's the idea that inputs equal outputs. And if we just tell people how to behave, they will do that, and it'll be fine. And my argument is this is a false consciousness of how the world works. It's a false image of how education actually works and should work. And the good news is that if we all absorb that too, we'll see that there are many entry points to making the system shift. I find a lot of educators get very frustrated because they believe that our task is to persuade politicians to do something differently. And I think if history tells us anything, it tells us that if we do something differently, they will have to respond to it. And if you're waiting for a government to come into power who understands how education works, you'll be waiting a very long time. That's been evidenced already in most countries. Not all countries, there's some, I think, who think differently about this. One of the problems is that politicians have very short time horizons. They're really looking for statistics they can brag about at the next election, which is 18 months away. And education is a very long process, long-term process, and it's the quick fix, really, that gets in our way. So I want to argue for a shift of metaphor, and to say it's an empowering shift of metaphor, and it means that we can get something done here, and that we should, because there are multiple points of leverage. But first, you see, what people talk a lot about in education is the need to get back to basics. Now, they've been talking about this since the beginning of education, by the way. Normally what people mean when they talk about the basics is a group of subjects that they think are more important than all the others. And particularly in education now, people talk about the STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and math. And back in England, I can say mathematics, can't I? Which we should anyway, because there are many numbers in mathematics. It's plural, isn't it? If there was one number, we could call it math. Whereas the whole principle is there are several numbers. Mathematics it shall be. So they think it's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. These are very important, fundamental disciplines. They are necessary, but they're not sufficient for the type of education that we need. In any case, the basics of education are not any group of subjects or disciplines. The basics of education are the purposes for which we do this. Why are we invested anyway in systems of mass public education? What's it for? And if we don't agree on the purposes, then we have a problem in talking about the means and the processes. Well, I think there are four purposes to public education, and I won't labour them, but I'll just point them out as a reference point. And not in any particular order. The first of them is economic. We all know that education has powerful economic purposes. It does, and it should. We should recognise it as a fact. We invest so much in it as communities because we expect education will contribute to our long-term economic health, vitality, and sustainability. That's how we got to have these systems in the first place. But the economic model of the day was industrialism, which is why the system looks the way it does. It is not that system anymore for us. We have a different set of imperatives now for our children and for ourselves if we're to make them economically independent, as I think we all want to do, don't we? Don't we want to make our children economically independent? We do. I can't tell you how much we want to make our children economically independent, and at once, if it's possible. But what sort of education do you need for that? There was a report published about 18 months ago by IBM in which they reviewed interviews they had with 1,800 leaders of companies in 80 countries, companies and organizations, and they asked them what their priorities are, what keeps them awake at night. And there were two really that came out in reverse order. They are here. The first, they said, in reverse order, was adaptability. How do you run organizations which are able to respond quickly to change? Now, this is a bottom-line issue for companies, because if you don't adapt quickly to changing circumstances, you're very likely to go under. And the history of corporate life around the world is populated with the corpses of once great corporations that didn't move quickly enough. Think, for example, about Kodak. Kodak is now in bankruptcy proceedings. Kodak was synonymous in the 20th century with photography. It was based on the invention of home photography. Kodak invented the Brownie camera, which was the iPad of its day in the early part of the 20th century. It has as much of a transformative effect on people's lives as the iPad is having on our lives now, relatively speaking. They invented home photography. They invented digital photography. And now they're out of business. And it's not because people have stopped taking photographs. On the contrary, people are taking more photographs than ever, aren't they? Irritatingly more photographs than ever. I get it all the time. People posting on Facebook, here's my cappuccino. Check this out from a different angle this time, And here it is after I've drunk half of it. Fascinating. Send me more of these photographs. What happened was that Instagram came along and whipped the ground really from beneath the feet of companies like Kodak. They just did not adapt. And the reason they didn't adapt is because organizations are not like machines, they're like organisms. They are living entities made up of people with feelings, motivations, roles, aspirations, passions, and ambitions. And if the organism doesn't respond, just as in the natural world, if it doesn't respond to changes in its environment, it dies. And it's what's happened to many companies, including most recently Kodak. So adaptability. But the top priority these CEOs pointed to for their company's long-term flourishing was creativity. They said, we need companies that are consistently and systematically creative. And how do you do that? We need people who can think differently, but we can't, this is the great irony, we can't always find them because kids coming out of universities and colleges these days find it very difficult to come up with fresh ideas. And why? They've been educated on this standard routine of routine testing, of multiple choice tests. We've been sort of systematically quashing the appetite for originality in our education systems. The irony is that a lot of these systems are in place now in what people believe to be the interests of the economy, and corporations say they want something else. So if we're to meet the economic requirement of education, we need to have systems which promote creativity and adaptability as bottom-line competencies, the very things that our education systems at the moment are being discouraged from doing. The second purpose of education is cultural. We live in a world that's increasingly complicated, increasingly riven, increasingly contested. Many of the great conflicts around the world now are not economic in character, although there's an economic dimension. They're cultural in character. I mean, look what's happening in the Middle East just now. Look what's been happening in Central Europe. Look what's happening across America. These are conflicts in people's ways of seeing the world, their ideologies, their value systems, hitting each other head on. And they may imperil us in the end. And it's a small enough planet as it is, but it's becoming more and more populated. But in any case, for ethical reasons as well as strategic ones, we need forms of education which enable people to understand how they came to think as they do, why their values are as they are, why their patterns of life are as they are, and why other people's are different. We need forms of education which help people to understand their own cultural identity and what formed it, and those of other people. Now, for that, you need a broad education. You need an education that gives equal weight to the arts, the humanities, to social studies, not just to technical subjects. By the way, I came across this quote which I thought you'd like about what it is to be British these days. I found this on the internet, where I find so many things. But I'm not showing you the other things, I'm just showing you this. What with the law being as it is. So, but I thought you'd like this. It said that being British these days, but you could read American for this, or any other nationality you like, but as you'll see. Being British these days means driving home in a German car, stopping to collect some Irish Guinness or Danish lager, picking up an Indian curry or Greek kebab, and spending the evening sitting on Swedish furniture, watching American programs on a Japanese TV. And the most British thing of all, suspicion of anything foreign. I think that's broadly right. So there's a big cultural agenda for education. The third is social. We need forms of education which engage this generation in the processes by which our communities are organised and governed. And there's a lot of evidence that people are pulling away from those roles. There's a lot of evidence of disengagement, disenfranchisement from our political institutions for reasons we can readily see. But John Dewey said this once, he said that every generation has to rediscover democracy. I think that's right. We live in Los Angeles. There was an election for the new mayor a couple of months ago. The election's gone on for 18 months. Millions of dollars have been spent on the election. 15% of the electorate showed up to vote for it. This was on a day when for reasons just of interest to me, I was looking into the life of Emily Davison. Do you remember Emily Davison? Who threw herself, it's thought anyway, under the hooves of the King's Horse at Epsom in 1930 and died 2 days later. She did that in the interests of sustaining votes for women. And here we are, just over a century later, and people aren't bothering to vote. People died for this, but we end up taking these things for granted. And of course we can't. It's actually, I have to say, I think it's one of the great themes of the work of the RSA, that it sets out actively to encourage this sort of social engagement, particularly in education. It's very important that we take part in these civil discourses and that we actively promote it. Well, you don't do that in education by giving people lessons on civics. You do it by having a culture which embodies these processes of participation. And great schools do that. The fourth purpose of education, though, is the ultimate one to be, which is personal. Because in the end, education is personal. It's about people. It's not about components and machines. It's people who are being educated. And if we know anything about people, it's they are different. They're driven by different talents, different abilities, different passions, different interests, and different motivations. One of the kind of signature features of humanity is diversity. Of course, it contrasts sharply with one of the organizational principles of education, which is conformity. And an education which isn't nuanced to individual differences soon finds that very many people are disengaged from it or alienated by it. And that's been the evidence in America, for example. About 30% of kids don't complete high school. And there are similar figures actually in some northern European countries as well. This is really what my new book is about, by the way, which you'll be pleased for me to mention now at this point. We're publishing a book called Finding Your Element, which is about the nature of individual talent and passion and the things that drive us. But if we don't understand that education is about people and individuals in all their diversity and multiplicity, then we keep making the mistakes that we make. If we treat it as a machine-age activity rather than the human process, then we run ourselves into a cul-de-sac. Well, if we recognize that, when I talk about changing education from the ground up, that's the ground I mean. You see, most political strategies start from the top down. They think if we can issue directives from the top and get people to conform, everything will improve. And the evidence is quite the contrary, that the more governments go into command and control mode, the more they misunderstand the nature of teaching and learning, the more they misunderstand the process of education, the more alienated people come from the whole process. So we have a situation here in the UK now where most of the major teacher unions have passed votes of no confidence in the government's education strategy. Well, that shouldn't promote a smug expression of satisfaction on the government. That should keep them awake all night thinking, well, hang on, how badly have we got this wrong? You cannot improve education by alienating the profession that carries it out. It would be like trying to improve education by vilifying doctors and nurses. Medicine, I'm sorry. It would be like improving medicine by vilifying doctors and nurses. You can't do that. So recognizing that education, I believe, can be encouraged from the top down is one thing, but it can only really be improved from the ground up by the people who do the work. Because in the end, it's not ministers of state who are teaching all our children, if they could. It's the people actually doing it in the schools. So when we talk about getting back to basics, I think we have to recognize at least this basic. There was a book published probably 25 years ago now, 30. Do you care when it was published? How much does this matter to you? I can check it if you like. We can Google it. We can Google it collectively. It was called The Empty Space by a theatre director called Peter Brook. Peter Brook is one of the most eminent theatre directors on Earth these days, and certainly of his generation. He founded, among other things, the Centre for Theatre Research in Paris. Peter Brook is convinced, has been throughout his working life, that theatre can be a genuinely transformative experience. It can be a deeply powerful experience for people and can change the way they look and feel. But he also says that, of course, most theatre is not like that. It's a night out. You know, it passes the evening, but it would have passed anyway. So he said, if you're really concerned to make theatre the most powerful experience it can be, we have to decide what it is we mean when we say theatre. We have to get back to basics and focus on what is it, what's fundamental. And he answers that question in a brief passage in the book by performing a thought experiment. He essentially says, you know, what can you if you take an average theatre performance, what can you take away and still have it, still have theatre? What's the core of it? What's the irreducible minimum? So he says, well, you know, you could take away the curtains, you don't need those. You could take away the script, a lot of theatre doesn't have script. You could take away the stage crew and the lighting, you don't need it. You can get rid of the director, definitely. You can get rid of the building. You don't need any of that. The only thing you can't get rid of and still have theatre is an actor in a space and somebody watching. Because the actor performs a drama, theatre describes the relationship between the audience and the performance. It's that relationship that we mean. So if we're trying to make theatre the most powerful experience it can be, we have to focus on that relationship between the performer and the audience. And he says we should add nothing to it unless it helps. And of course, a lot of what we add to theatre at the moment distracts from that relationship. It substitutes for it. Well, the analogy for me with education is exact. Because at the heart of education is a teacher and a learner. And we've, over time, kind of obfuscated that relationship with every type of accretion and distraction. We have syllabuses, we have testing regimes, testing companies, political ideologies, political purposes, subject loyalties, union issues, building codes, all of the things, timetables, schedules. It's why we can spend all day long discussing education and never mention teaching or learning. But if there's no teaching and learning happening, there is no education going on. So if we're going to improve education, we have to improve that bit. And everything else has to take a place around it and not get in the middle of it or get in the way of it. So the focus on teaching and learning to me is vital. Now, what we know about learners is, about children, is that children are learning organisms. Children don't need to be helped to learn, for the most part. They are born with a vast, voracious appetite for learning. In fact, they evolve in the womb with a great voracious appetite for learning. There's a lot of evidence now that beyond a certain point, children are absorbing all kinds of things from their mother while they're in utero. You know, they're picking up voice rhythms. They're actually developing tastes for certain types of nutrient. It's why kids come out listening to the cadences of language. Now, what we also know is you don't teach your child to speak. Most kids get to learn to speak, you know, in the first year and a half or so of their life. But you don't teach them, do you? If you've got kids, you know that. You don't sit them down, you know, when they get to the age of 1 and say, okay, here's the situation. You know, you probably notice your mother and I keep making all these noises. And they actually refer to things that are in the room here. All these things have names, as we call them. And here's a list of them. Now, there are roughly 50,000 to get through in the next couple of months. And when we've got all those down, we'll start to introduce verbs which can tell you what you can do with these things. And later on, things you might have done with them in certain circumstances and things you could have done possibly in the past, or at least the hypothetical past. Of course, you can't do that. They just pick it up. I mean, you nudge them, you correct them, you encourage them. You don't teach them to speak. We do teach them to write. That's a different thing. Writing appeared much later in human evolution than speech. I mean, very recently, actually, we've had a history of written systems. But my point is that children have a vast appetite for learning. And it only starts to dissipate when we educate them. That's to say, when we put them in buildings designed for the purpose and put them in serried ranks and start to force-feed them information in which they may or may not have an interest. Now, the conceit of education is that, you know, children learn anyway. The conceit of education is that we can help them do it better and direct them to things they may not otherwise learn if left to their own devices. That's why we plan to do this sort of stuff. But learning will happen anyway, and with the new technologies happening more and more, actually, spontaneously. what it means is if we really want education to be effective, we have to focus on the process of teaching and learning. And teaching, I think, over the course of the past number of years, these so-called reform movements, has become reduced in the political discourse to a kind of delivery system. You know, your job is to deliver the national curriculum. I don't know when we borrowed all this lexicon from FedEx. I don't know when that began to happen, that we dropped the curriculum off for you. But teaching has become seen as a kind of delivery system, and teachers have become seen as kind of functionaries in the raising of standards and the administration of tests. Actually, teaching is an art form. Everything I've ever learned and seen about teaching convinces me that is the case. It's not enough to be a good teacher to know your stuff, though you need to know it. You don't need to know everything, but you need to know enough to be able to teach it. I mean, I don't speak Romanian, and I can't therefore teach it, truthfully. There's no point saying to me, oh, go on. You know. Come on, I mean, how hard can it be? You know, really. Small children speak it in Romania. Come on, you're a grown-up. I can't do it. So you need to know your stuff, enough of it anyway. But more than that, you need to be able to excite people about the material. You need to engage them. You need to pique their imaginations. You need to fuel their creativity. You need to drive their passion for it. You need to get them to want to learn this. You need to find points of entry. That's the gift of a great teacher. Somebody was saying to me earlier today, you know, how can you do that with 35 kids in the class? I know teachers, and my wife Terry was among them when I first met her, with 42 kids in the class, and the place was humming and alive with activity and learning. And you do that not by you having to teach them everything, but by getting them actively involved in teaching themselves and teaching each other. In Harvard now, they talk a lot about the flipped classroom. The physics professors there who have stopped lecturing people, which is ironic for me to be reporting on now, I know that, but instead he gets the students in groups to work together and teach each other. And I find it very interesting that finally, you know, Harvard and our universities have discovered what every good primary school teacher has known for years, you know, that people teach themselves if you create the right conditions for it. So one of the ways that we improve education is by recognizing that it happens at the point of where teachers and learners meet. If it doesn't happen there, it doesn't happen at all in formal, organized education systems. So you can't improve education by ignoring that relationship or demeaning it or vilifying it. But it also means if you are in that relationship, you hold the tools of power right in your hands. You can change this system yourself. You don't need to wait for anybody to do it. Now, the shift, I think, is this. I said that we have mechanistic metaphors of education. We do, for the most part. We have systems of education, too. But it's not a mechanistic system. And this, I think, is one of our points of entry into the future. That a school, just like a child or a teacher, is not a component. They are living organisms, living, breathing entities. A school is a community of reciprocating individuals who develop their own culture, their own way of seeing things, their own habits and rituals and so on. You can define culture in different ways. One is, a more formal way to say it, is it's the values and forms of behavior that characterize different social groups. In American corporate speak, they often say culture is the way we do things around here. But it's like that. And I said at the end of my last talk, it's about habits and habitats. It's about the rhythms of behavior and the physical space that people occupy. All schools are different, all communities are unique, and they're all living organisms, all of them. And it's why I think we should recognize that education is not mechanistic. It's better to adapt metaphors from agriculture or ecology or from biology. You see, biologists will talk about different sorts of systems. There are, for example, simple systems, like in the physical world, in the mechanical world, you know, the brake on a bicycle is a simple system. You press the lever, clamps the wheel, simple. There are complicated systems, like aeroplanes, which are made up of thousands of simple systems, but they all have to articulate. So it's actually a complicated system. But at the end of it, the plane hasn't changed. It's still a plane. It's still a plane that took off. You know, it hasn't learned anything from the process of being a plane. In biology, people tend to talk much more about complex systems. That's to say, systems which are evolving and reciprocating, like a human body where all the parts reciprocate and feed and support each other. Or more technically, people call them complex adaptive systems. Systems which are highly intricate, which are internally evolving and constantly adapting to their environment. It's why Kodak went out of business. It stopped adapting. And it could have adapted had they thought differently. Education is like that. It's not a single system. It's not a system in which one person is in control. It's a vast, complex, adaptive system which involves the interests of teachers, parents, the business community, politicians, architects. It's a complex, reciprocating, adapting system. And like with any ecological system, it's affected by the climate. And if you change the climate, you can change how and under what conditions this thing will begin to flourish. Now, I say this because I have been in schools all around the world which have been in very desperate places, but the schools themselves have been thriving and enlivening the whole area because they've recognized they're part of an intricate ecosystem. I was in a school recently in Koreatown in Los Angeles. This place is in an area of high crime and low income, high poverty area, and yet it's an absolute oasis of achievement because the particular teacher that I was working with has inspired the kids in the class with a sense of their own possibility. That's what culture is, really. You know, culture is a set of expectations and a set of permissions. I think if we recognize that schools are ecosystems and they're part of a larger ecosystem, and that this is constantly interacting with economic shifts, technological changes, social movements, cultural changes as well, we can begin to see that there isn't a single point of influence. The teachers in the system, the head teachers, are just as influential in their own world as the policymakers. And if you are a teacher, if you're a school principal, if you're a superintendent, if you run a school district, so far as the kids are concerned who go to your school, you are the education system. If you close the door on your children, you are the education system. It's not the Secretary of State, it's you. And if you begin to change your practice, if you begin to change the environment of the school, if you, in other words, concentrate on your own microclimate in the school as part of the larger climate, eventually you start to affect the whole. That's how all social movements have happened. We've been staying in Soho this weekend. It was the Gay Pride March this weekend. It's a fantastic event. It was interesting to me, though, at the height of flower power in the 1960s, that march couldn't have happened. Wouldn't have happened. People didn't have that permission at the time. And it'd be very hard to say when it happened, but it did happen. Cultural change happens like that. It can be incremental, it can be sudden, it can be incremental. But when people say times change but values don't, they're making a fundamental mistake. Actually, values do change over time. But they don't change by the activities of governments. They change from the ground up. People starting to act differently and demanding something else. I'm always struck by the fact, you know, that rock and roll, one of the great cultural movements of my generation, was not a government plan. You know? It was not the case that a group of culture ministers got together in Brussels for a briefing from two civil servants who discovered 3 chords, you know, and said, you know, we think, ministers, these will come together in lots of interesting combinations, and Jenkins here has designed some hairstyles that might go along with it. You know. We thought we'd run a few focus groups and see how it takes off. No, this thing just took off and bowled over everything in its path. People thought, this is great. The internet was not a government plan. Al Gore, despite what he says, didn't think of it. And the people who did think about it, Tim Berners-Lee did not have in mind what's actually happened and how fast this has grown. The last example I'll give you is this. I mentioned the Brownie camera. I was thinking recently about the iPad, you know, or actually the iPhone. When the iPhone was introduced in 2007, it had a facility built into it by Jonathan Ives and Steve Jobs and the team there to receive apps. And when it was launched, I think there were 800 apps available to the iPhone. There are now 750,000 of them, of these apps. Most of them not thought of by Apple. In fact, the vast majority are not thought of by Apple or anticipated by them either. One of them turns your iPhone into a blues harmonica. There are actually 36 versions of this. But you download the thing and your phone becomes a blues harmonica. You know, you turn it on the side, you get these little holes along the side, and you can suck and blow on your phone. Why? You know, I mean, I know meetings can be depressing, but do you need to play the Delta Blues in the coffee break? I don't know. You see, I can't imagine that when Jonathan Ives and Steve Jobs sat together to plan the iPhone, they said, look, here's the situation. Nokia is dominating the world at the moment. We're going to take them down. We're going to produce a smartphone. And here's some of the things it has to do. You have to be able to get online with it. You have to be able to send text messages. You have to be able to search the internet. Maybe make a phone call. It's not vital. But don't forget, it's absolutely essential that you can play the Delta Blues on this thing, because who's going to carry a phone where you can't channel Howling Wolf? It's just not going to happen. Human culture is essentially unpredictable, but it accumulates over the creative activities of individuals feeding off each other. That's how organic growth happens. And when I say the revolution is needed and it should start from the ground up, what I just want to tell you is it's already happening. This isn't a theory. There are already points of disruption across the whole planet here. And I'm just encouraging you to believe in it and to try to move our systems into the 21st century. I was in Austin, Texas last week, where the whole school district has given their kids iPads, for example. It's a revolution in the way they're teaching and learning in that school district. Look at the massive online open courses, the MOOCs, which are beginning to really drive a wedge into the whole process of higher education. You can multiply these examples. The system is already adapting. The part of the system that's not adapting is the high level of government policy. And if any other social movement is to go by, the movement will gather force before they waken up to it. And I hope that they'll recognize that they too are part of the ecosystem, and that they should at least understand that the real role of leaders when it comes to education, whether you're a teacher or a head teacher, or you're the head of a district, or you're the Secretary of State for Education, your proper role, if you have a loving relationship with education, is not to try and command and control it, but to recognize your place in climate control. And if you can help to change the climate of expectation in education, if you can change what's happening at the ground, then you've changed the world. Thank you. Thank you.
Ken, thanks for that. Do you mind just saying 1, 2, 3?
What?
Just say 1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3.
Thank you. It's just that you made 4 points. If we have to edit it down, we'll have to change that to 3 points or 2 points. So I just...
how about 1?
No, 2 or 3 will be
1,
fine.
2.
Okay.
Work with it.
I'm only going to ask one question
Right.
because there's so many people here and they will have questions of their own. I'll just ask you when, if you're thinking of your question, make it short and sharp so we can get as many in as we possibly can. This kind of debate between progressive and traditional views of education has been rumbling on for far too long. And some people would like to kind of caricature the debate in Britain, for example, as that between the followers of E.D. Hirsch, who talks about facts, the sage on the stage, subjects and knowledge, and you who talk about creativity, the guide at the side, projects, engagement. Is that in any way a useful characterization? How might we better understand the division that exists between you and someone like Hirsch, for example?
I don't think it is very useful, honestly, because when people talk about creativity as the opposite of learning information or the opposite of discipline, they're just misunderstanding the terms of the argument. I mean, I've argued from the outset that you can't be creative in the abstract. To be creative, you have to do something. You can't be genuinely creative, for example, in mathematics if you don't understand the mathematics. You can't be creative in music if you can't play the instrument. But understanding what the dynamics of that process are is the thing at issue. I wrote a piece recently in The Guardian taking issue with Michael Gove, who had said on Question Time that you can't be a creative musician if you can't, until you've learnt all your scales. Well, the evidence is all against that. I remember, when the Beatles started out, they knew 2 chords. In fact, they heard there was some guy in Liverpool who knew a 3rd chord. And they got on the bus and went and met him, and they got the 3rd chord, and they started the Beatles. But they knew an awful lot more chords by the time they'd finished. There's a dynamic here. And I'm not arguing that you shouldn't understand. I've just been arguing we should understand the past. I think the issue with people like E.D. Hirsch is he wants to set it out in some canon, it seems. of things that people have to know, and particularly in the new national curriculum, it seems, things you have to know by when. And that, to me, contradicts the essentially dynamic nature of teaching and learning. But on the broader question, I think the whole issue between progressive and education is misconceived, probably on both sides. I think if progressive educators, so-called, think that education is all about finding it out for yourself and not having any structure or discipline, they're mistaken. And if people who argue for traditionalism think that the way we're going to face the future is by getting back to some 19th century view of the grammar school, they've got it completely wrong.
And why does this dichotomy continue? I mean, we don't have this dichotomy in health. We don't, there isn't the kind of fundamental divide between a group of medics who think that treatment should be like, I mean, there are people who dismiss conventional medicine, but overall, there is a general consensus amongst most people who work within the kind of Western medical tradition. So why is it in education it's always been riven all the way back to the kind of black reports in the 60s, all the way through? What's going on there?
Well, I mean, there are these big debates in medicine too, as you know, about traditional alternative forms of medicine. It's not tribal
in this way, though, is it?
I think some of it is, but that's not. I know it's just a reference point, but yeah, I mean, there are. I think there are people who argue strongly for holistic approaches to medicine rather than just a prescription drug approach. But interestingly, I mean, I'm arguing for forms of education which are highly personalised. That we should be tailoring education to the learners. It should be individualised around individual talents. I don't mean we should only teach people what they want to learn, but we should recognise we have different learning styles. That's part of the art form of being a teacher. We should recognise that we have different talents and possibilities, among all the things we need to learn in common. And there's a movement in that way in medicine too, towards personalised education. There's no point giving people of different sizes, weights and ages exactly the same load of drugs. You need to tailor it to the individual. I think the difference here, though, is that education is nestled into cultural issues. It's nestled into political issues. It's an expression somebody once used of education is that education is an essentially contested concept. There is something at the heart of it which will always raise people's oppositional view. It's like religion. People aren't going to sign up to the same religion if they've been brought up in different traditions. They're going to argue about the relative merits of it. So I'm not trying to smooth them out and say, well, can we all just hold hands and agree? I see part of my role these days as championing a view of education which has been around for a very long time, which is holistic, which is pluralistic, and which is personalised. And I'm not the first person to argue for this. You can trace everything I'm saying back to Dewey, Montessori, Pestalozzi. You can keep going back if you like. It's all Plowden. It's been in and out of the mainstream. All I'm trying to do is argue for what I see every day as being practically the case, that if you have schools which engage people's imaginations, they're better schools. If you respect and venerate the teaching profession, you get a better profession. And I spend a lot of my time trying to counter what I see as misconceptions. I'm happy for people to disagree with me, as long as they understand what they're disagreeing with. What I find, as we all would, irritating is when people tell me I think something which I don't and then disagree with it.
Right, I'm going to make myself very unpopular now by only choosing a handful of questions from there'll be lots and lots. But let's just take 3 questions first of all. Let's take one here. And make them really short, even though you're brilliantly expert and you could talk for hours yourself. There's the mic.
Thank you, Matthew. I love the idea. It's not what you said.
Sorry. I can tell you who he is.
No, we all know he is, but just tell the room, for the record.
I'm Guy Claxton. The idea of teachers and students kind of jamming together about education in the classroom, not just being creative within education, but being creative about education. Teachers clearly, in some sense, are the senior partners and have to take a lead in that process. They have to be the ones who are going to push the network, as you described it, of, permissions and expectations. So tell us a little bit about what they might do differently on Monday morning.
Do you know the game Just a Minute? Because that's the position you're in now. You've got 1 minute, no hesitation, no deviation, no repetition. That way we can get 8 questions in.
All right. Are you going to keep saying that, though?
No. Right. I might occasionally say repetition in that.
Well, Guy, for those of you who don't know, Guy's done wonderful work on learning and learning power, and I highly recommend the stuff he's written on this. I was at an event a couple of years ago. It was a peace summit in Vancouver. It was called the Vancouver Peace Summit, as a matter of fact. The Canadians are very good at titles, we find. And the guest of honour on the platform, I was hosting the opening session, was the Dalai Lama. He was an absolutely wonderful man. And at one point he was asked the question, And there was a very long pause. There were 2,000 people in the room. There was a very long pause. And people were thinking, what's he going to say? This is going to be great. It's the Dalai Lama. And we all kind of mentally leant forward. And after about a minute, it seemed, he opened his mouth. We thought, here it comes. And he said, I don't know. and we thought, what do you mean you don't know? You're the Dalai Lama. You know, we don't know. You know, but he said, no, I hadn't thought about that before. What do you think? I thought that was wonderful. You know, here's one of the world's great teachers, quite happy to say, I don't know. And I think sometimes that is what great teachers should recognise they can easily do. That you're right, they are in the lead, they're the facilitator. But very often, the role of a teacher is to engage kids in answering questions they themselves don't know the answer to. The teacher doesn't. I've always felt this. The role of a teacher is to enable learning, to facilitate it. In the end, you can't teach anybody to learn anything. You can't make them learn it. Learning it is a personal process. You can create optimum conditions where they will, and often asking them the question rather than telling the answer is the way to do it. And encouraging collaboration between kids is the best way to do it. And I think if teachers take some of the heat off themselves and realise they don't always have to be the one who knows, but that real learning often happens most effectively by asking the really pertinent question, the intriguing question, and being on hand, of course, if you do happen to have things that you know. I mean, like with Romanian, I mean, I don't want somebody to say to me, well, what do you think the word for table might be? You know, and we spend the next 4 weeks trying to guess. You know, I think, no, tell me. So it's a delicate balance here between instruction and intrigue.
Who's next? Yeah, right at the back of the room.
Louis Coiffet from the Pearson think tank.
I'm sorry?
Louis Coiffet from the Pearson think tank.
Yeah.
With the growing use of data in education, do you see that helping or hindering your vision for the future?
With the what? What was
Growing use of data.
Oh, the growing. No, I'm all for data. But in its place, you know, it's like, you know, I mean, doctors. I always want to compare doctors to teachers in a sense, because being a teacher is an act of connoisseurship. You know, I mean, if you go to see the doctor, you want the doctor to know lots of stuff. You don't want them to be on the first day of the degree. You know, you want them to know a lot of things. But you don't want them to tell you everything they know. You want them to be able to apply it to your case, particularly here and now. So being a doctor is to exercise judgment and connoisseurship, and so it is with teaching. You don't have to download everything you know to every student. You're very selective about it. And doctors need data, too. Teachers need data. I mean, it's important to have information that you can base it on. Diagnostic data is very helpful in teaching to get some sense of progress. Some things lend themselves in education to quantitative data. Can you do this or can you not do this? And that's true in the arts, for example, as much as it is in the sciences. It's the use that's made of it that is the issue, and the place it occupies in the culture. The problem, I think, latterly in education has been that we've become data-obsessed and data-driven. You know, that standardized testing has come to replace actual learning. The kids have become kind of instruments of the data, rather than the data being a helpful resource for teachers. And this isn't to argue against any form of testing, but testing should be a support. It shouldn't be the purpose of education. I mean, I can't imagine there's a kid in the country who gets up in the morning and thinks, what can I do to raise the nation's reading scores? I mean, you know, call me. You know, I'm here to serve. It's getting the right way around, and of course it's a particular issue for Pearson, you know, which is very active in the whole field of testing. I just want to see it in its proper place in education, not dominating it.
We'll take 3 questions together, but they've got to be really brief. There's a woman here, and there's a guy right in the back row over there. Go.
Barbie Golding-Parr, Chief Officer for Woodard Academies Trust. We were out in Austin, Texas over the Easter period, and setting aside all that we learned on the pedagogical approach, there were 2 things that came out on an organisational one. One was about moving towards smaller institutions rather than larger institutions, and the second one was grant funding new organisations, particularly on the new technology side, where the outputs would mean that you would get the grant to go forwards. So what's your view on those 2 aspects?
Hold that, Ken. Then right at the back, briefly.
Sam Conniff from Liberty. You gave a lot of clear ideas that individuals, professionals and organisations within the education ecosystem can do. But if we're going to move from education being something that happens to young people, or move from a push to a pull, what would your message to young people directly be for the role that they can play helping the revolution take place?
Okay, and then finally, on that topic, there's a person, you're going to have to choose one of your students. Yeah, go on.
Right.
Wait for the mic, wait for the mic.
Can I write this down, Matthew? Do you mind?
Yeah, sure.
Hello, sir. Prince Chavaka, head boy of Whitley Academy, one of the RSA's academies. This whole debate and discussion seems to have excluded students. Do you think students should have a voice in this? And if so, how do we get involved and how do we make ourselves heard? And also, slightly attached to that, why aren't policy makers, and especially Michael Gove, why is he not listening to what the teachers' unions and students are clearly saying to him?
Okay, so fortunately the second and the third question kind of overlap,
yes,
about listening to young people, and there was the first question, which I was looking around the rest of the room, so I didn't actually hear it, but what, did you hear it?
I was listening.
Oh, good. It's not easy doing this job, you know.
Well, just in reverse order. Honestly, I wouldn't presume to peer into the psychology of Michael Gove. I think that's a dangerous place to look. Yeah, and I don't have the strength of character to come out of there alive, I don't think. I don't know. Why isn't he listening to teachers? I don't know. I think it's outrageous. As I say, you can't improve education by alienating the profession. I don't know what he thinks is going to... And there was an egregious article that he wrote in the Daily Mail attacking the 100 or so academics who wrote to him offering some advice. I mean, Guy was among them, and I would have signed it if I'd been here. And he referred to professors of education and people who work in education research as the blob, and said that this is a group of people who have been a blight on education. I think it's preposterously rude and outrageous from anybody, but from a Secretary of State for Education, to attack the people who do the work in the field, who've devoted their lives to it. I think it's beyond belief that he would do that. Why, I don't know. I've never met him. He's probably a lovely man. I'm sorry if I gave you the impression of leaving students out. I was hoping to imply it. I put them at the very heart of this process. It's all about the students, of whatever age they happen to be. And I say students of all ages can teach themselves these days without the active support. And it's partly what I'm arguing about here is that I'm encouraging students to get involved in the process. And it's why I mentioned the Dalai Lama thing, particularly, for example, when it comes to the Dalai Lama thing. Is that a thing? I don't know. The Dalai Lama thing. Particularly when it comes to the opportunities in new technologies. We call them new. I mean, they've been around for a long time now. But one of the opportunities in the new digital technologies is to radically personalize education. There's a school, for example, in New York called the School of One. Not because there's just one person. No, it's really not a very popular school, to be honest, but it's really a bad school. No, because every student in the school has their own daily timetable. There's a computer program, and at the end of the day, they feed all the information in. The next day, they go in, they print it out and say, this is what you're doing today. And it depends on what they did the day before, where they feel they're up to. So everybody's timetable is personalised. There's no reason we shouldn't do that, really, in schools. We only do it this way because previously there was Mr. Jenkins with the timetable and a pencil and a rubber, and he couldn't work it all out, or she couldn't. You know, how do you move 1,500 people around individually? You couldn't do that. So you did it in blocks. So there are many ways in which I think students should be actively engaged in this revolution. And I think they always were in a good way. I mean, student-centred education was always at the heart of what we were talking about. So it's great that you're here to talk about that. On the size of school thing, you know, I'm always tempted to say the size of school doesn't really matter. I mean, we know it does. I think once you become the size of a small town, it starts to get a bit irritating. But Bill Gates, for example, has spent a lot of money through the Gates Foundation on the small school initiative. It didn't make much difference. They've spent all kinds of money on all sorts of things that haven't made a lot of difference. And the reason is that the only thing that really makes a difference is the quality of teaching and learning. And that can happen in big schools. It can happen in small schools. People are obsessed at the moment with structural issues, like, for example, the government's betting all its money on free schools and academies. In America, there's a big movement for charter schools. There are good charter schools, bad charter schools. It's not whether the structure is not really the critical issue. If you look at Finland, they're not trying to do all this stuff in the same way. That's not happening in South Korea. The structural issues are not at the heart of it. I think if we don't understand that the heart of it is the quality of teaching and learning, and everything else has to gather round that, and if it helps, fine. If it doesn't, stop it, then we'll miss the point. And I assume, for my own part, that what lies behind this here and in the States is a determined effort to break up the state system. You know, it's to privatise education and put aside this massive investment in public education. And I think it's a catastrophic mistake myself, because for most kids it's the only shot they get, and we should give them the best opportunity that we can. And if the aim of the government is to break up the state system and to privatise it, then could they please tell us that, so we can have a proper conversation about it, rather than slipping it under the radar, which is what I think is going on.
So, thank you all for coming. Sorry to all those whose questions I didn't take. Sorry to all those who are watching online because they couldn't get in the room and I didn't take any of their tweeted questions. I'm really sorry. Copies of Ken's new book are available here, and if you bring them up to the stage, he'll happily sign them for you. But before that stampede starts, I also ought to thank Samsung, who made this event possible today, again, for doing that. But before you come and get your book, it just reminds me to ask you to join me in thanking Sir Ken Robinson.